Hello everybody, welcome to DeathGroundReviews. This is a channel for horror, suspense, science fiction, and fantasy. I like to review books and just talk about those subjects in general. And today's video was inspired by Criminali's YouTube channel. The tag is called Evolution of a Reader. And this was originally started by Jack at Spread Book Joy, or at least that's where Criminali first saw this reader tag. And so basically I'm going to talk about just how my reading has changed over the years. And there's a few different questions I'll go through in the process of explaining that. So let's get on with it, shall we? The first question is, how has my taste in books evolved over the years? So when I was a young kid, I was just obsessed with like science books. I wanted to get my hands on anything about sharks and snakes and different things like that. I remember I saw the movie Jaws as a young boy, and that movie terrified me, but I also just became totally obsessed with sharks as a result of it. And so any science book I could find about sharks, or I'd pick up at the bookmobile or the library, and I'd gobble that thing down and just rehearse and memorize facts about sharks all the time. And I loved books about snakes because, I loved going out in the hills. We kind of lived in a desert area, and I'd go out in the hills and try to catch them, and those books would show me places where I could find snakes, where they like to hide, and how to feed them if I did catch one for a pet. So, yeah, as a kid, I loved science books of that sort. When it came to fiction, I loved getting into some of those choose-your-own-adventure books, Those were quite exciting stories about space travel. I remember reading one about like some kind of haunted amusement park or something like that as a kid. So yeah, really big into that in my younger years. As I got older, in my teenage years, I mainly became just obsessed with movies. I loved watching science fiction movies, action movies. I was really big into the James Bond films when I was 13 or so. And then I started getting into horror probably late teens or so. I remember I went to the movie theater and saw the movie The Ring. That was kind of what really sparked my interest in horror. Although, thinking back though, when I was real young, probably 8, 9 years old, I saw the movie The Poltergeist. So that's probably the real genesis of my interest in horror. Then when I got into 18, 19, early 20s, that's when I really started to read regularly. Because that was the period of my life when I decided that I wanted to become a writer. And so, of course, one of the most important tools for a writer is reading. And so I started picking up Stephen King. Started gobbling Stephen King down like crazy. Philip K. Dick. I became really big fan of Philip K. Dick around that time. Excuse me. But not as big of a fan these days of Philip K. Dick. Although it's been a while since I've read any of his books. I had to go back and read some of them again. But yeah, huge into a lot of that horror stuff, science fiction stuff. Today, I guess it hasn't changed very much. When I think about it, I still love reading a lot of that. I'll still read a Stephen King book when it comes out. I guess I found a little more interest in a lot of indie authors today that I didn't have much interest in my 20s. So that's one change that's evolved, is the interest in indie authors. And that's come mainly through like Twitter and Instagram. So yeah, next question. How you read. Has the format of your reading changed much? I think it has changed. When I was younger, I was picking up so many books from the bookmobile or the library, and they were all physical books, paperback, hardcover. Nowadays, Kindle, e-reader. I get a lot of e-books because they're so easily accessible. You get them in seconds once you buy them there through Amazon. So I still read a lot on Kindle. And But I still read a lot of physical books. I'm not a huge fan of audiobooks. I have occasionally, sometimes on YouTube, I might find an audiobook on there and listen to it. Excuse me. I tend to retain memory of the story better when I'm reading a physical form of it. For some reason, audio form, I don't always pick up the details as well. So that's part of the reason I don't read audiobook as much, listen to audiobooks as much. Next question. How much you read? Do you read more or less? When do you read? And how often changed over the years? Do I read more or less? I think in some ways I kind of read less. You know, in my early 20s, I was in college and I was an English literature major. And so, you know, I was in multiple classes, reading multiple books and jumping back and forth between those books. And so I was reading all day long a lot of the time back then. Although sometimes, though, I wouldn't read a whole book back then. I would just get like the basic gist of certain parts. Sometimes I would even find truncated forms of it, cliff notes sometimes or something. But yeah, I spent so much of the day back then reading. Whereas nowadays, you know, I'll focus usually on one book at a time. And I try to read around 40 pages a day. Because I find I can get through, you know, shorter books in about a week or so, maybe a little longer. And how I do it, though, is I don't necessarily read one big 40-page chunk like late in the evening or anything. I'll read snippets throughout the day. So maybe around lunchtime I'll read 10 pages, you know, and then later in the afternoon I'll read another 10 pages. And then later at night while I'm, you know, watching TV or you know, playing some video games, maybe I'll take a break and read another 10 pages until I get those 40 pages read. So that's kind of the pattern I've developed now. Next question. How has BookTube changed you as a reader? I think consistency, you know, because in reviewing books, I need to make sure that, you know, I get a book done within a week or so I can review it in a timely manner. So I try to make sure that I'm reading those 40 pages a day consistently. Whereas there were times in the past where I think one thing that's changed is there were times in the past when I would skip around between different books. Whereas now I really try to focus on one book until I get it done. Before BookTube, sometimes I would read 3 or 5 books at the same time and jump around, and then until one of them snagged my attention so much that I couldn't let it go. And then I would end up ignoring all those other books. So that's one change I've noticed. So that concludes my video for how my reading has evolved over time. It says also that I need to tag someone. So the person I will tag is Rami Younger. He's a horror author who's been on my channel before. Sometimes he and I talk about horror movies and such. So I'll tag him. His YouTube channel is at Grand Thanatos is the tag for it. And yeah, thanks for joining me on DeathGroundReviews, guys. I'll see you next time.